I suck at clapping. I missed that day in kindergarten. Everybody was like, clap, have fun. I was probably like, ugh.
Located 35... I'm not the one who usually does this.
Oh my God. Listen to you. I don't know where else to look.
Look down. Look away.
Look away.
Nope, I'm starting over. Shh.
Oh, wow. Whoa. Holy crap. You mean I don't get a clap again? I don't get you? Right. I mean, like, exactly. Like, yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Exactly. Gotta stop saying that.
Frances had a nephew, Jimmy. No! Her 16-year-old nephew, Jimmy. No. Mother of God, please help me. Nephew Kenneth. Her nephew Kenneth. I'm done. You just say. I'm Kathy with a K.
And I'm Kathy with a C.
And this
is Killer Destinations.
Today's destination is Brockton, Massachusetts. Located 35 miles south of Boston, Brockton has a rich history. It was first settled in the 17th century and became a city on April 9th, 1881. The city has the distinction of holding a number of firsts, including in 1890 being the first city in America to have a department store Santa for the kids to come and visit at Christmas time. Farms gave way to factories, and Brockton became an epicenter of the shoe and textile industries, earning the name Shoe City. At the dawn of the 20th century, the city had a population of 40,000, and more than 6,000 of them were employed in over 100 separate shoe manufacturing entities. Brockton was also dubbed the City of Champions for its rich sports history. It's actually the hometown of the two boxing greats, Rocky Marciano and Marvin Hagler. Today, Brockton has a growing commercial base with a population of 100,000 residents and a thriving downtown with great restaurants, shops, and historical museums. But Brockton has a dark side, reflected by its higher than average crime rate. And in 2003, this dark side was illuminated when an accidental fire turned out to be anything but.
On April 17, 2003, just before 5 a.m., 17-year-old Frances Choi called 911 to report a fire in her Brockton home. She was awakened to her mother's screams. She heard her mother yelling, "Frances, there's a fire! Frances, there's a fire!" Frances woke up, opened her door, saw smoke, and immediately got on the phone. The occupants of the house included her parents, 53-year-old Ann Choi, and her father, 64-year-old Jimmy Choi. It also included a nephew who was 16 years old, just 1 year younger than Frances. Now, this house was a split level. So there were 6 stairs leading up to the second level and 6 stairs leading down to the lower level, which included a basement. Frances remained on the 911 call with the dispatcher until firefighters arrived. And when firefighters arrived on the scene, the house seemed relatively normal until they went around the side and they saw smoke billowing out the windows. Firefighters saw Frances with her head out the window and her 16-year-old nephew, Kenneth Choi, with his head out his bedroom window. Both of them were rescued with ladders in a very dramatic fashion, and she was terrified, as was he. And then Frances said, "My parents are still inside." So firefighters rushed to the master bedroom, which was on the second floor, only to find Ann and Jimmy Choi on the ground, unconscious. Firefighters immediately took them both downstairs. Ann was placed in an ambulance, and Jimmy was given CPR on the front lawn until the next ambulance arrived. He was then taken to the hospital, but ultimately was transferred to a second hospital, all within a matter of minutes. Unfortunately, at 5:53 a.m., just about an hour after the initial 911 call, Ann Choi, who had burns over 60% of her body, died from smoke inhalation. Jimmy Choi, who had been transferred to the second hospital, was clinging to life. As Jimmy Choi was clinging to life, Frances and Kenneth were at the same hospital where Mrs. Choi's body was laying. and they were receiving oxygen, both having suffered from smoke inhalation.
So the Choi family was kind of a modern family, as it were. Jimmy Choi, the father, who, as Kathy said, was 64 years old, he and his wife, Anne, who was 53, they had grown up in Hong Kong, so they were of Chinese descent, and had moved to Vietnam before emigrating to Boston. They'd actually lived in Boston's Chinatown for a time in an apartment before they were able to buy a house in Brockton, which they wanted to use to provide their daughter Frances with a better education and a home to grow up in and a backyard to play in. And this was also an ideal location because they had relatives nearby. So Jimmy had worked for the past 13 years for a medical device company working on the assembly line. He had actually been on medical leave for the past 7 months. This was back to September of 2024 because he had been diagnosed with cancer. Now, his wife Anne had also worked there, but she had left the company in 1999. But while Anne no longer worked there, Jimmy's brother-in-law and niece both were employed by the same company. Their daughter, Frances, who was 17 years old and a senior in high school, was, like any senior, having a bit of senioritis at this point and also looking forward to all the things that came with ending high school. She had been accepted at 4 different colleges. She always got good grades. She was active in student council, by all accounts happy, and she had a boyfriend who was a couple of years older than she was, but they had met in high school.
And the senioritis was exhibited because her grades dropped in the last semester of high school.
Substantially.
Which totally happened to me. Absolutely. I could not care less.
I can't say that
I'm
happened
sure,
to me.
exactly.
I wish
Kathy,
I had
on
those
the other
stories
hand,
to tell.
no. It's not a good story.
It is a good story. You went to a great college. You have a great life. You're well educated. You're a lawyer.
Well,
and you're a podcaster. What did I do? I just went to college and worked for Congress.
Yeah. It's like, really quickly, side note, I had to, when I worked for a brief period of time with a police department, I had to get my transcripts from high school. And
Did you really?
Yes. And I was like, oh my God,
like,
I was
can
accepted
explain.
to college with this? It was bad. There's hope, people. Yeah. There's hope for the young.
See, I don't think
don't
there
give
is
up
now.
on your kids.
I think it's so much harder now.
It is so much harder now. But
so you can't get those grades.
Hold on, no.
And I'm talking for both of us.
Look at my daughter.
Yes.
She couldn't care less about grades in
That's
high
true.
school, and her trajectory
is nothing
went
but up.
upward in college. So
she's
like
worked super hard, and she was really intelligent.
Yeah,
to
you
start with.
parents, like, hang on. There is hope springs eternal.
That's true. Good point. Good point. As Kathy said, when Frances was rescued by the fire department, they also rescued her 16-year-old nephew, Kenneth. So Frances's father, Jimmy, was actually Kenneth's grandpa. Kenneth had been born in China, and Hong Kong specifically, where he grew up with his mom and dad, but at some point his mom and dad divorced. His father committed suicide, so Kenneth was living with his mom, but then at some point his mom remarried and her new husband did not want the burden of having another child. Jimmy had been trying for 3 years to get Kenneth's mom to agree to let Kenneth go out and live with the Chois in Brockton. Jimmy wanted Kenneth to have all the opportunities that living in America afforded that, of course, he would never get in Hong Kong. And it was finally when Kenneth's mom married this other man that she agreed to let Kenneth move out to the Chois. This happened in 2000, and it was a year later that Jimmy was actually granted guardianship over Kenneth so he could stay.
So Kenneth was 13, right?
Right, when he
came to the United States, and he had never met Anne Choi, Jimmy Choi, or Frances Choi.
Or any of the extended family who we said lived close to them.
Right, and he wasn't a fluent English speaker.
At all.
I can't imagine how difficult this was for that boy.
Yeah. Frances took him under her wing and made sure he had a ride to school and told him what kind of clothes he needed to wear and that kind of thing. I'm sure she taught him some English phrases he might need to know and whatnot.
So she was like a known entity around campus, and so she was trying to help him acclimate.
Right.
Which I think would just be so difficult for him.
Yeah, absolutely.
State Trooper Jean Stewart was assigned to determine the cause of the fire. So she went through the house afterwards. And one of the things that was really important and what stood out when she interviewed the firefighters on the scene was that they smelled gasoline immediately upon entering the home. So she looked all over the house and she found 2 soda bottles on the top steps of the basement which contained gasoline. However, she did not believe that the gas was an accelerant that started the fire. Trooper Stewart believed that the fire originated from a mattress in the basement. It extended upwards through the wall paneling and ignited the back of a couch on the first level. And from there, the burning couch produced heat and sent smoke soaring up to the second story. But there were also fires on the second story, primarily in Ann Choi and Jimmy Choi's bedroom. So she believed that Ann and Jimmy had their bedroom door open at the time the fire started. There was smoke and fire damage in Kenneth and Frances's bedroom, but it wasn't the consuming blaze that was found in the Choi parents' room.
And part of that was because Frances and Kenneth both had their doors closed. But as you said, Jimmy and Ann did not have their door closed.
Exactly. She also observed a towel that had been rolled up near Kenneth's door, and she assumed that perhaps he was smart enough to put it there to avoid the smoke getting underneath his door. She also noticed that there was a refillable lighter and a can of lighter fluid in Kenneth's room, but there was no flammable liquid whatsoever in Frances's room. What the investigator also discovered was that in Ann and Jimmy's room, in addition to the door open, there was a plastic melted jug. She had no idea at the time what it contained and knew it needed to be tested. Ultimately, Trooper Stewart believed that the cause of the fire was a result of a deliberate act.
So as we already mentioned, after Frances and Kenneth went to the hospital, they were being given oxygen for the smoke inhalation they had suffered. Now, while they were there, a detective and a trooper went and interviewed Kenneth and Frances. They just kind of wanted to find out what had happened, what did they see, what did they know. Frances was the one who had called 911, as we said, and they kind of wanted to talk to her a little bit about that as well. They also wanted to talk to Kenneth because as they were going through the house, once the fire was put out, in his room, which, as Kathy said, there was a towel under his door, so it actually had the least damage of any of the other rooms in the house, they found 2 handwritten notes that were of a suspicious nature. And they really wanted to kind of find out what Kenneth had to say about them. So he was shown these 2 handwritten notes, and he said they weren't his, that he didn't know what they were. He didn't have anything to do with them. He said that all he remembered was going to sleep. He said it was about 10:15. And next he was awakened. He heard Ann screaming that there was a fire, and then heard Frances making a 911 call, or at least he assumed it was a 911 call, telling firefighters or dispatch that there was a fire at their house and to come and help them. When they spoke to Frances, she said that she woke to her mom screaming. She heard her saying over and over, "Frances, there's a fire, there's a fire." So she called 911. She actually called and talked to a dispatcher and somehow got cut off. And the dispatcher called back. And for whatever reason, the phone stayed connected and she was able to tell them where they were, what was going on. She stayed on the phone. The dispatcher stayed on the phone with Frances until she heard the firefighters arrive. And as soon as the firefighters, as we said, got her, she immediately told them that both of her parents were still there and where their room was so that they could go help them.
And then after, so they stayed, they got their oxygen, and then Kenneth and Frances went back to the property. And detectives were kind of surprised because they were still milling about the scene and collecting evidence and whatnot. And they spoke with Frances, specifically a detective Clark spoke with Frances and said, "Hey, what are you doing back at the property? What's going on?" And she said, "My relatives were concerned about the property." And now this is about 10:15 in the morning. So it's a little over 5 hours after the initial 911 call.
And they were concerned about people stealing and looting, correct?
Correct.
Because I had told Kathy one of the things that I remember from when my dad died is that my mom actually had a neighbor stay at the house during the funeral, because it is a very common thing. And remember, my dad was LAPD. It's a very common thing when people die or there's a tragedy like a fire, for wonderful upstanding citizens to go make it even worse for the family and steal whatever they can.
I know. It's just like disgusting.
It
It's
absolutely is.
It's
There's a special place in hell for those people.
totally. Oh my gosh.
But yeah, so when we were talking about that, it totally made sense to me why they would be like, no, you got to go back to the house.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So anyway, they go back to the house. It's still being investigated. And Detective Clark says, hey, can you talk to me for a few minutes? Like, what's going on? Kenneth at this point spoke English, but Frances was particularly fluent, obviously.
And she was also the only child of Jimmy and Anne. So I don't know if we said, but Frances's parents weren't fluent in English. And so they relied on her for almost everything. She paid the bills. She, made sure that the mortgage was correct and that, everything was taken care of, and went to doctor's appointments with them and all that type of thing. So she was the one who would know everything.
Exactly. And so when they were back at the house after having been in the hospital, and the detective is surprised to see them, he starts asking questions. And basically it's like, hey, do you have any idea why there were these gas containers, and why was there this gas odor? He was saying there was a gas odor in her parents' bedroom. And she said, I have no idea. I don't know. I have no idea. I was asleep. So the detective starts just chatting with her and asking her questions about, tell me about your family and what's your parents' financial situation. And he was just sort of like, interviewing her.
Yeah. Were you happy? Did the family get along?
Yeah, exactly. And so he asked about insurance. And in response to the insurance question, Frances says, I'm the sole beneficiary of a life insurance policy that's worth over $100,000. And she also knew that there was $36,000 left on the mortgage.
Which is exactly because how we explained. She was in charge of everything.
Exactly. She made sure all the bills got paid.
Yeah.
But she, again, denied having anything to do with the fire. And then he asked her, well, why was there gas found on your pants? Because apparently the canines had alerted to the sweatpants that she was wearing.
Right.
And she's like, I have no idea why there would be any gas on my pants. It makes no sense to me. I have no idea. At some point, her relatives said, your father is in very serious condition. We need to go see him. So the trooper says, now at this point, they've been interviewing Frances for about an hour at the property. And the trooper says, oh, she can get in the back of my car and we'll take her to the hospital. And I believe Kenneth went with a relative to the hospital. Anyway, so there was another 45 minutes that she spent with the detectives just talking about her life. Yeah. The fact that she was accepted to 4 universities.
Hadn't made a decision yet.
That exactly. And she had a boyfriend and all this kind of stuff. Like she was looking forward to prom, just all of this stuff was coming out, in these interviews. Anyway, this officer drives her to the hospital to see what is her dying father. And in front of Frances and Kenneth and the rest of the relatives, Jimmy Choi passes away.
Of course, Frances called her boyfriend after her dad died, and he, of course, drove straight there and picked her up and took her to his house, which was about 200 miles away. Kenneth might have been with her, we're not positive, but he also might have stayed with a relative. After she's at her boyfriend's house, the police call her and say, hey, can you return to the scene? Because we kind of have some questions we want to ask and some things we want to show you. And she said, I'm 200 miles away. So
I don't want to come.
Yeah, It's been a day.
Yeah.
And they were like, no, maybe you should come here. So,
yeah, they're like, we have some items we want to show you.
Exactly. And
so she goes back to the scene.
Of course.
Yeah.
And they say, oh, you know what? We don't have the items here. They're at the police station. So come with us there. And she did.
And she gets to the police station at about 7:45 that night.
Which means we're talking more than 14 hours of dealing with the very worst day of your entire life.
Exactly.
Times 1,000.
I can't even imagine the adrenaline dump.
Yeah.
Kenneth was also taken to the police station, and he was with, because he's 16 at the time, the police thought it would be a good idea for him to have a relative. So he was with a relative. I don't know who in particular.
And he wasn't fluent in English.
Correct. Not completely fluent.
Right.
He was pretty good, but you're right. Not completely fluent.
The two were put into separate interrogation rooms. They were given their Miranda rights and they were interviewed. The first one that we're aware of the police talking to was Kenneth. So as he's sitting in the interrogation room, the police bring up to him the 2 notes that they said they'd found in his bedroom. Those were the ones that when they were at the hospital, the police had first broached the subject, and he said, "Those aren't mine." In the interrogation room several hours later, he repeated, "Those aren't mine." And they said, "We had a handwriting expert look at these." And the reason they did that, Kath, was because they actually had to do with planning and setting a fire. So when they said we had a handwriting expert look at these, he said, "Okay, they're mine, but I only wrote them because some kid at school told me to." It was one of those letters where you have to write like 13 copies and mail them to your friends so you don't die. Or, one of those things that...
Yeah, it was something like, I had to write this out, give it to 10 friends, or I would have bad luck.
Oh, that's what it was. Okay.
Yeah, bad luck.
That I would have bad luck.
Yeah.
And so, and they were like, no, you're wrong. They kept adamant with this. And so he eventually admitted, okay, I only wrote them and we didn't want to kill anyone. That wasn't what the notes were for. And they said, who else was responsible? Who helped you with these notes? And Kenneth said, Francis.
And meanwhile, Francis is being interviewed. Obviously Kathy said they're separated. And so the detectives are bouncing back and forth, so she has a lot of time to think and ruminate. And I cannot believe how exhausted these 2 youngsters must have been. But anyway, so she told detectives, "I have no idea anything about how the fire started. You guys are talking about gas and smelling gas and seeing gas jugs. I don't know what that's about. Just deny, 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 deny." Then the detectives bring Kenneth into her interrogation room, and he basically tries to convince her to tell the truth. "Francis, tell the truth. Like, they saw these notes that I made. Tell the truth.
Yeah.
Tell the truth.
They know you were behind this.
They know you were behind it. The jig is up." And she's like, no. Deny, 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 deny. And then at some point, I'm sure one of the detectives, it didn't say this in the documents, the court documents that we looked at.
Yeah, most of this is from court documents. So.
Yeah, exactly. Like 99.9.
Yes.
But reading between the lines, the cop was like, "I'm going to arrest you and you're going to be booked for murder."
Exactly. And he said it in that tone, which is weird.
Exactly.
Boston cops don't sound like that.
I know. I wish I could do a good Boston accent.
I'm
but
glad
anyway,
you can't.
We need Cece here. She can do it.
I know. You're right.
Anyway, so again, reading between the lines, I believe she is threatened that she is going to be booked for murder. And well, come on, we're going to take you to the booking area kind of thing.
Right.
So she's like, wait. Let's keep talking. I want to keep talking to you. So she says, "Fine. I planned it." And then she goes, "Wait a second. I didn't plan it. I had nothing to do with it." And then she said, "Maybe Kenneth is trying to accuse me. He's trying to put my name on it," as she called it. "He wants my family's money. He wants my parents dead." And she starts talking about some of the tension between Kenneth and her parents. So, but now the detective's like, okay, she made this admission. She's going to make more. And at some point, and Kathy and I couldn't quite figure out where she was handcuffed.
Right.
Like we figured she was, at some point she's handcuffed to a railing.
Which we assume was in a hallway.
Right.
But we don't know that for sure.
Maybe it was outside of booking. I don't know. The place that she was afraid to go.
Maybe it was in the lobby.
I don't know.
Just kidding.
Exactly. Maybe it was in a mall. I don't know.
Handicap stall in the bathroom.
Exactly.
Where do they have railings in the police station?
So that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Anyway, so she's handcuffed to this railing. And again, he, we believe he says, that's it, you're getting booked. So again, she's like, wait. I want to talk. I want to talk some more.
The thought of going to jail, I mean, it's bad enough to be in an interrogation room, but now you're actually going behind bars. Like, you would do almost anything to stop that from happening.
It's really scary, let me tell you.
Yeah. She's not kidding. I, on the other hand, have no experience with that.
One of these days,
Nope.
the truth will out.
Nope, not one of these days. Never.
So anyway, Frances tells the detective that she had gotten up at about 3 or 4 in the morning, went outside and filled these containers with fuel, with gasoline.
She actually called them cups.
Yes, she called them cups. That's true. And yes, and she placed the fuel in the cups and she put them on the stairway, I think in the basement.
Correct.
Okay. And
Which is where they found those soda bottles that were full of gas.
correct. Which I'm sure the detective was like,
Cup, soda bottle,
yeah,
potato.
But hey, were you the one who put that on the stairway? Anyway,
Yeah.
So she basically said, we used milk and soda containers that we got from downstairs. And so she talks about how, she participated in this plan to burn the house down.
Very slowly, it starts to come out.
Exactly. Then she says, wait a second, I'm lying.
Haha, just kidding.
I had nothing to do with this.
Right. Knew a lot about it, but said she had nothing to do with it.
with this. And none of these interviews were audio or video recorded.
Correct.
And this is 2003.
17-year-old Frances Choi and 16-year-old Kenneth Choi were indicted for 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Jimmy and Ann Choi and for arson of a dwelling. They were both sent to county jail to await trial, and they were going to be tried separately. So 2 different cases.
So the first trial that went forward was Frances's, and this is in 2008, 5 years after the house fire. And she was denied bail, so she spent the entire time behind bars. So the prosecution portrayed her as sort of this dragon lady,
Right.
this emotionless,
Calm in the face of fire and death and danger.
Like they didn't say psychopath, but that was the implication that they wanted the jury to draw. And they talked about the fact that she volunteered that she had a $100,000 life insurance policy and that there was only $36,000 owed on the mortgage, and that her father was very controlling. Mm-hmm. And she told detectives in one of the conversations on the way to the hospital, I believe, when she was in the backseat of the car, that she resented her dad because he didn't want her spending a lot of time with her boyfriend. And she was accepted to, was it Suffolk University? Mm-hmm. And
that was one of them.
Yeah, one of them, one of the 4. And she wanted to live on campus. And he said, absolutely not.
Because both of her parents had significant health problems. As we said, her father was battling cancer and her mom had eye problems. She
and
had
a bad
vision
back.
problems, a bad back, all sorts of things. And again, neither of them spoke English very well at all.
Right.
And so they needed her for their day-to-day existence.
Totally. She was the total backbone of that family.
And it's not unreasonable to be resentful of that.
Correct.
Part of it too was he didn't approve of the boyfriend. He didn't approve of how much time she was spending with him. If he lived 200 miles away, I could get that a little bit because it's not like she could pop down the street and visit him for an hour and then come back.
Right. And then I guess there was a period of time where he was like sneaking and, seeing her on the sly.
Yeah.
And then I guess dad came home and found him there and was really, really upset.
Of course.
I believe he was a freshman in college at the time.
Yes.
And so my understanding is that he was not allowed to be in the house when parents weren't there.
Yeah.
Reasonable.
We weren't allowed to have boys upstairs.
Reasonable. Anyway, so neither was I. I
you
didn't have it upstairs. We weren't allowed to have boys anywhere in the living room. The living room. And my parents' living room was kind of formal, so it was not a welcoming place to be.
It still is formal. It's it's fun to go to parties there.
So this is how they painted Frances's relationship with her father, and basically said she wanted freedom, and she knew this life insurance policy was going to give her that freedom.
Right.
And Frances, during her trial, she did not take the stand, but she essentially, through her counsel, pointed the finger at her nephew Kenneth. So Frances was basically saying Kenneth loved his computer. He loved his computer games. And if you'll notice, his computer was not in his bedroom at the time of the fire. Through her attorney, Frances pointed out that her relationship with her parents was better than Kenneth's.
Right.
And she said, like, a month before the fire.
And the murders.
Exactly. That's a good point. A better point, in fact.
Little things.
And her mom accused Kenneth of stealing some jewelry.
Right.
And Frances basically said, look, during Chinese New Year, my parents gave me more money. And I had to do all the interior chores. Kenneth had to do the exterior chores, and my dad yelled at him a lot. So there was all this
reason for resentment between Kenneth and Frances.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So the detectives, of course, told the jury about Frances's admissions, saying, I did it. And then taking the further steps to say at 3 or 4 a.m., I got up, I filled these things with gasoline, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He also admitted that she immediately denied them thereafter. However, a canine officer testified. This canine alerted to what the prosecution said was accelerant.
Gas residue, I believe.
Exactly. On Frances's pants. Then a state chemist took the stand and testified to exactly that. There was gas residue on her pants.
Well, Canine Fido was good.
Exactly. But the jury couldn't agree. With all of this evidence against her and evidence that impugned Kenneth, the jury could not agree, and it was declared a mistrial.
And so as a result, Frances was sent back to jail.
Because the prosecution immediately said, we are retrying her.
They said, we're going to have another bite at the apple.
That's exactly right.
Thank you. Killer Destination School of Law, baby. You know, I bet Kimmy's jealous.
I bet, you know what? Kim Kardashian probably is jealous of you.
I know. She should be.
100%.
Shortly after Frances's trial ended in a mistrial, Kenneth Choi had his trial.
And again, this is 5 years post-murder.
Right. And he also was denied bail and had spent the past 5 years behind bars as well. Unsurprisingly, he placed all the blame on Frances. He said, I'm just an immigrant kid. Frances, even though she was just a year older, she was much more mature than I was. She had much more resentment toward her mom and dad. I was this immigrant kid who's, you know, his grandma and step grandma are now giving him a chance at freedom in America.
And he relied on Frances
for a lot
of like social life and social cues and
even
school.
just getting around and all of that. Mm-hmm. So, and then he of course reiterated what he told police already, that she was angry because her parents wouldn't let her move in with her boyfriend, that she was also angry that her parents had told her that when she went to college, she wasn't going to get to live in the dorms, which, do you know what this reminds me of? Is the Menendez brothers. Because remember, Eric, what really set them off on their killing spree, for lack of a better phrase, it's true, was the fact that he had been accepted to UCLA and his parents were like, nope, you're commuting from home.
You're going to stay here.
Right. But the underlying theme of all of the trial for Kenneth on his part was that he had always maintained that he was not responsible through every single police interrogation. Frances, on the other hand, had admitted she was responsible. So the case goes to the jury, and Kenneth Choi was acquitted of arson and the murders of Jimmy and Ann Choi. In 2008, Frances's trial had ended in a mistrial, and the prosecutor said, we're taking a second bite at the apple. So almost 3 years later, in February of 2011, so Frances has now been behind bars for about half of her life, trial began. But here's what was different about this one. While the experts once again got up and the detectives and talked about what they found and what they heard and what they saw, there was a witness at this trial that really threatened to put an end to everything. Kenneth, who had been acquitted, was the prosecution's star witness. Even though he was acquitted, and so he wasn't going to be able to be tried for the murders of Anne and Jimmy Choi or the arson, the prosecutor still had the power to charge him with a couple of things, like a conspiracy to commit murder, that type of thing. And so he was given immunity if he agreed to testify at Francis's trial, which he did. So when he gets on the stand, he starts talking about the fact that it was about a month before the fire that Francis really starts complaining about wanting better parents. And again, it was the same thing we had talked about. She didn't want to stay at home. She wanted to live with her boyfriend. She wanted to live away at college, just have more freedom. Because she also, one of the things we didn't say, in addition to student council and all the other things she was doing, she actually had a part-time job working at an office supply store. So she had a very full life, and she's still being hemmed in when she's, at 17, 18, that's what all kids are looking to do,
Exactly.
right? They just want to grow and go and do.
Everyone feels hemmed in at 17.
And at 40.
Which is good.
Exactly.
It's like hem those children in at 17.
Yeah.
Do the hemming. Anyway.
Because at 18, you have no choice. Well, you do if you still have the financial power.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what you want.
And one of the things at this trial, Kath, is that Kenneth got into talking about the efforts that Francis discussed out loud with him.
She basically thought if she had enough money, she could get out.
Right. So she said, let's stage a robbery. And then the insurance company will give us money and we can have some freedom. Ultimately, she realized, like, wait a second, maybe the insurance company doesn't give you money. Maybe they just replace things, which they don't. But it's okay. She didn't know.
Right.
So then she apparently told Kenneth, okay, let's stage a fire. Let's burn down the property and get the insurance money. So Kenneth testified. She talked about using gasoline. And Francis said, we can collect the gas in milk cartons and soda containers because we use the gas for mowing the lawn and
right.
like just sort of the practical components of burning a house down.
Right.
Exactly.
Easy to get to, easy to access.
Right. And she also talked to him about what the plan would be and where the gas cans would be placed.
Kenneth had to admit to those 2 notes that the police had talked to him about and said they weren't his and that a friend made him write it and all of that. He had to admit that they were his and he had lied about writing them.
And multiple lies about them.
Right. Over and over and over again until it was finally, well, even when they said it was in your writing, we know that we hired a handwriting expert. He was like, well, but I was made to do it by a kid at school.
So the first note is what he called the shorthand note. And he said that Francis told him to write this. And the top half talked about a robbery and the bottom half talked about a fire. And Kath, what cracked me up about this is that it was on stationery and the stationery had a little note at the top that said, a note from Kenneth Choi.
Right.
And it totally cracked me up because it totally brought me back. It's like when you were a kid, you were given stationery as a gift or you were given a phone book as a gift.
Personalized. That was key.
Yeah. And if somebody gave you a personalized pencil to go with that, you were in heaven.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Life got no better.
You could write to the world. Anyway, so on his little personal note, he wrote about a fire and he wrote about a robbery. And he said that Frances was not happy because she did not understand his shorthand notes. So what she said was, you need to write it out better and you need to be specific. And, so I'm just going to read a couple of the things that were written on the final version of the note, which was the second note. And both of these were placed in evidence at trial. So for example, go to his own room, get the gas ready, pour the bottle, put it near the TV. Go to the basement, pour gas into 3 bottles, put 2 near the stairs, 1 near the basement. Fire up the living room and the kitchen. Go back to the room, change your clothes, fire up the clothes in the hallway. So it's like he had all these very specific steps that he said were those things that Francis directed him to create. And he ultimately said, look, I wrote it at her direction, but I didn't really believe that this was going to happen. I didn't believe that Francis really wanted to set a fire.
Basically, he said that on the night of the fire, when Francis was talking to him about it, he's like, are we really going to do it? And she said, yes. And he was like, whoa, 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 this isn't funny.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not doing it.
I'm not having anything to do with this.
And she's like, I am doing it. And then got mad at him because he was like, I'm not going down to that basement to light those gas bottles that we put together down there. And so she got angry and was like, you dummy, just go to your room. And he did. He thought he heard Francis bringing containers of gasoline up the stairs, but he wasn't sure what it was. But then he heard the whoosh of a fire, slammed his door closed, and heard Francis running up the stairs. That's when he also heard Anne Choi screaming Francis's name, telling her that there was a fire in the house. And so he just hid in his bedroom. He denied placing a towel under his door, but maybe he didn't remember doing it because there was one that was just kind of pushed to the side when he finally opened his door, when his door was finally open, but he stuck his head out the window and tried to get fresh air and have the firefighters see him and see what he was doing. He also said that when he and Francis were in the ambulance waiting to be taken to the hospital, so this was of course after Jimmy and Anne had already been transported because their injuries were so much more severe, he said Francis looked at him and told him, do not tell anybody what happened tonight. Despite his testimony, however, the jury was once again deadlocked, and Francis's trial was again declared a mistrial. For the first time in 8 years, however, Francis was finally released and placed under home confinement, living with her relatives.
Because the prosecution once again said, we're going to retry her.
And what's another way to say that?
A second bite at the apple.
Third bite in this case.
Exactly. But Frances Choi was only home 3 months before her third trial started.
Now, I'm sorry, is that a little odd? I mean, that sounds like such a short amount of time for everybody to regroup and go back.
But considering we are 8 years post-murder, I'm sure the judge was like, let's get this going. But also,
what else new do they have?
No, but there's a benefit to doing a trial quickly. So I think in criminal cases, it's not particularly unusual, but but I'm sure the judge was like, enough already. If you want to try it, prosecution, we're going to go for round 3 really quickly.
Okay.
So she only had freedom for 3 months. And of course, all the hot topics were the same. The gas on the pants, the admissions at the police station, the resentment toward her parents, the fact that she was a beneficiary on the life insurance, all the things that created an incentive for murder to give her the freedom that she wanted.
But there was one major difference from her trial from 3 months earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Her nephew, Kenneth, dipped.
He dipped.
He dippity-doo-dah'd his way all the way to another country.
Exactly. So he went back to Hong Kong because he was facing heroin charges.
Little things.
A minor technicality.
It was misunderstanding.
Exactly. So because Kenneth's testimony was memorialized in the second trial,
just 3 months earlier,
and Francis's attorney had a full opportunity to cross-examine Kenneth while he was on the stand, the judge decided they can read his testimony into the record.
But it wasn't just reading his testimony.
It was not reading his testimony. What they did was they took his testimony and they did a dramatic reenactment.
Exactly.
And so it was more like role playing.
It was like dinner theater.
Yeah. And so this happens actually, like reading testimony into the record is a thing that happens. There's an exception to the hearsay rule about it, and et cetera, et cetera, blah, 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 blah. And I actually had to do that once, read someone's testimony. It was a doctor who could not appear at trial. And At the time, I had just gotten off maternity. I was actually, now that I think about, on maternity leave, and I wore the most hideous maternity dress you could ever imagine in your life.
I don't believe you.
I look nothing like a doctor. But it was a Q&A, and I just sat in the witness stand and I read the transcript into the record. It was extremely perfunctory. There was no drama. I didn't even practice. I didn't even have the transcript ahead of time, which was very nerve-wracking. Anyway, in this situation, in Frances's situation, the district attorney and a deputy district attorney role played. So one was the examiner, and then the district attorney, the deputy DA, played Kenneth.
Right.
And apparently it was like a dramatic reenactment and a little over the top, to say the least. But
I wonder if they serve popcorn.
I know, seriously.
That would have been good. Beer.
Yeah. But all of that occurred, but Frances's attorney focused on the fact that her fingerprints were not found on the Sprite bottles in the basement. They were not found on the notes that Kenneth admitted to writing. They weren't found on the disposable lighter that was left in the living room, but they pointed out that Kenneth Choi's fingerprints were found on the note. So like, she had no incriminating evidence that was directly attached to her.
To those specific things.
Correct. But Kenneth did. Anyway, so in closing argument, the prosecution repeatedly emphasized the gas residue that was found on her pants, while Kenneth's clothing did not have gas residue. And on May 16th, 2011, 8 years after Jimmy and Ann Choi were brutally murdered in a fire in their home, the jury found Frances guilty of murder and arson, and she was sentenced
to LWOP. Once she was found guilty, a court appoints a new attorney for her. She'd had the same attorney through her first 3 trials, but now this is a different attorney. And
because he needs to be familiar with appellate work.
Correct. He actually knew that he couldn't do it on his own, and so he reached out to a colleague. He believed that Frances should not have been convicted, so he reached out to a colleague of his. Her name was Sharon Beckman, and she happened to be an attorney working for the Boston College Innocence Program.
Her attorney, who was appointed by the court to handle all the post-conviction motions, was... what was his name?
John Barter.
John Barter, yes.
In 2017, so 6 years after Frances has been sent to prison, Attorney Beckman signed on as co-counsel.
And this is 14 years after the murder.
Right. So they're off on their attempt to get Frances out of prison. So in the intervening years since Frances had been convicted, the attorneys found unexpected information that they knew they had to get before a judge. Now, among these items, Kath, and I know you've seen these more than I have because you read them much more carefully. There were a lot of documents that hadn't been produced for the defense as they're required to be. So one of them was the very first 911 call that we said had been cut off. They never got those. There were letters that Frances had sent to her family members from jail that the prosecution had copies of, but the defense did not. And it was also recorded conversations that Frances had made when she was in jail. And again, the prosecution had copies, the defense did not. One of the other really huge things, Kathy, is that the defense was never informed that there were a couple of subsequent house fires at the Choi home. These were done while Frances was incarcerated, but Kenneth was not.
Yeah, Kenneth had been acquitted by this point.
Exactly. And, for the defense, they're like, there could be an alternative suspect. We never knew about these 2 fires that had happened.
I mean, how random to have 3 fires at one house.
Exactly. Then there was some exculpatory evidence that came to light that had to do with Kenneth. He had run away from the Choi home. And this was just 4 months before the murder. Jimmy Choi had actually filed a missing persons report with the Brockton PD to say that Kenneth was gone. And he thought that Kenneth was selling drugs, and they had gotten into kind of a tiff about that. And so Kenneth had run off.
Yeah. And Jimmy Choi was very blunt about it.
Right.
Yeah. He's on the lam because he's selling drugs and I disagree with it.
So apparently it was resolved because they were able to locate Kenneth at Brockton High School. Again, it shows another motive for murder. And these documents were in Detective Clark's file. But again, defense never got them.
Yeah, they were never produced. So the only time the defense saw these was in the post-conviction request for documents.
And Detective Clark had this information in his files prior to Francis's first trial. And then at trial, there was additional evidence that Kenneth's grandfather, so Jimmy Choi, had been physically and verbally abusive to him. There were a number of 911 calls that had been made, and it was something that Kenneth had actually complained to his mother about back in Hong Kong, that, Grandpa Jimmy would yell at him and sometimes he struck him. And I thought it was interesting. Kenneth's mother did an interview in which she said, I told him that, I'm paraphrasing, that he had to suck it up.
Yeah.
Because his grandfather was providing so much for him that he wouldn't have otherwise. And familial loyalty or filial loyalty is
huge,
top of the heap for Chinese culture. And Kenneth was being disrespectful. She said, any amount of flack that your grandpa gives you, you get to take and say thank you.
Yeah.
And so there were all these different things. And I guess that, as Kathy had said, his step-grandmother Anne had accused him of stealing jewelry. So there's all these little things. But in closing arguments, when the prosecutors were talking about this, when it had been brought up, he just said, this is just nothing more than teenagers having issues with their parents. There's nothing more to it. But in fact, it shows that Kenneth had motive to do this.
Also in closing argument, the prosecution said, why would Kenneth Choi burn the house down? He has no motive. That makes no sense. Well, when you find out that your grandfather has told police that you're a drug dealer,
right,
there's some motive there.
And the defense has nothing to say to that, right? Because they have no idea that any of these documents exist.
Exactly.
Now, the other thing was on closing argument, this is in Francis's third trial where she was convicted. As we said, the prosecutor emphasized that while, Kenneth's fingerprints may have been on the notes and Francis's weren't anywhere, Francis had gas residue on her clothes, but not Kenneth. Well, it turned out that they had records that showed that not only was Kenneth's clothing never tested for gas residue, it was never even submitted to the lab for testing. So the prosecution implied something that wasn't real at all.
Another issue that the prosecution raised was attorney incompetence. And if you are somebody who is trying a murder case and it goes south and it goes up on appeal, you fall on your sword. You sign whatever declaration the appellate attorney wants you to do, as long as it's truthful, to make it look as though your client had ineffective assistance of counsel. One of the things that the appellate counsel pointed out was that Francis's lawyer never brought an expert witness to talk about this gas residue on Francis's pants. He made a motion to have the state of Massachusetts pay for an expert, and it had to have been an out-of-state expert, Kath, because the judge denied the motion and said, you got to find somebody local. You got to find somebody in Massachusetts. Well, he never bothered.
Yeah.
He didn't do that.
And he also didn't appeal the ruling.
So the appellate attorneys also pointed out that Francis's lawyer was aware of a witness, a potential witness, okay? And it was a friend of Kenneth's.
A female friend.
Correct.
Maybe a girlfriend.
That the attorney never put on the stand. And they said, you should have dug deeper into this girl to see what she can help you with. Because what happened was during the time they were investigating the appellate issues, this gal signed a declaration in 2015 under the penalty of perjury saying that before Francis was convicted, Kenneth admitted to starting the fire.
Right.
And what she said was in 2011, again, this was the same year that she was tried for the second and third time, this witness was involved in a car accident with Kenneth. And Kenneth told her, you can't say that I was driving. You have to take the blame. So please get to the scene. And she admits to being the driver, even though she had lied. But before she was taken off in the ambulance, she said, you know what? I'm lying. I wasn't the driver. It was Kenneth. But it showed he was somebody who would lie about something like that.
Right.
She also said that while she was living with Kenneth for a period of time, my impression is that she lived with some of his relatives. I'm not 100% sure about that. But she said he told her, I beat the criminal charge. I beat a murder charge. I was found
double murder charge.
Yes. I was found not guilty, even though I bought the gas and I lit the fire. So he admitted to it. And he appeared to care very little about the fact that Frances,
his aunt,
was facing life in prison for what he had done. And another smaller point that the appellate lawyer said about Frances's attorney was that he never played the 911 tape for the jury, because in the 911 tape, you could hear her. She was poised.
Right. Well, as we said, the police had painted her as being kind of a dragon woman. She was very calm,
Emotionless.
too calm.
Yes,
exactly. And emotionless.
Exactly. And in the 911 tape, Kath and I listened to it, and you could hear her, you could hear the stress in her voice. Okay. She was poised enough to give out information, but she was stressed out.
You could hear the cracking in her voice.
Exactly. And you could, the concern for her parents.
Right.
And, so at different points, she started like kind of crying, whimpering, and, and stay with me on the phone, that
right.
kind of thing. So playing the 911 tape could have shed shade, so to speak, on the detective's assertion that she was an incredibly emotionless person.
Well, and it wasn't just their narrative at that point. They can say whatever they want, but the fact that they didn't play it at all, the fact that the defense didn't play it, made that true.
One of the things also that the appellate attorneys found out was that one of the officers lied. The fact that there was testimony in all three of Frances's trials about these admissions she made at the police station.
This was the long interview after she and Kenneth were both taken there and separated.
Right. When she was afraid of booking. Right. And then when she was handcuffed to this railing.
Yeah.
Her attorney consistently said, there's only 4 lines, less than half a page, where she is making these statements. Are you sure these are what they made? Can I see your notes? And he didn't have any notes. Can I see the recording? Yeah. There's no recording. Well, what this detective said was in 2003 at the Brockton Police Department, they didn't have the capacity to record. They didn't have the equipment.
Right.
The attorneys found out that was incorrect. They had the equipment. They totally had the equipment.
And there was a department policy that if there's the equipment, you always record it.
Exactly.
And he didn't.
Through the course of this appellate work, and I'm telling you, this fight was probably 4 years, where the appellate attorneys wanted emails from the prosecution and the detectives involved in the case. And this was a bitter struggle, probably, like I said, at least 4 years. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Because they never felt like they were getting the whole, they
were getting the runaround.
Exactly. All the documents. Ultimately, they were given emails for a period of 3 years, was it?
3 or 4. Yeah.
Okay. And in these emails, one of them was from a district attorney to one of the detectives, the main detective, basically coaching him on what to say on the stand.
Well, it gave him the questions she was going to ask and what she expected his answers to be.
Yeah, like on a particular point.
So it wasn't just coaching. It was, here's what I'm going to say. Here's what I expect you to say.
Yeah. So, but more importantly, there were emails between the 2 DAs who were handling the prosecution. And these emails were viewed very, very badly by the court once they were presented to the court. So all of this evidence came to light in a post-conviction motion for relief. The emails were attached, and the emails were racial in nature.
It was Asian stereotyping.
Exactly. But what they did is they took the movie, what was it movie?
16 Candles.
16 Candles.
Jake!
Exactly. A classic 1980s film that was
John Hughes.
Hysterical. John Hughes was like the man. And but there was a character in 16 Candles called Long Duck Dong.
And he was an Asian exchange student.
Exactly. And And it was hysterical in the movie. However, you're a prosecutor. You should be above the humor. You don't put this in an email. You don't make fun of people in a criminal prosecution.
It's also 20 years later.
It's way too serious.
Yeah.
It's way too serious. So there were a lot of references to Long Duck Dong in these emails, comparing Kenneth to Long Duck Dong. And at one point, Kenneth got his girlfriend pregnant. And so the DAs were talking about that. Kenneth Choi is having a baby. And then the other one says, well, do you know who the mom is? And the response was Frances, so they implying incest. They also, so again, lots of references to Long Duck Dong.
Wasn't there a t-shirt with like a line from the movie?
Like No Yankee, My Wanky.
That was it.
Classic line.
Yeah.
Funny movie.
Not for this.
Not appropriate for a murder case.
Well, yeah. And you know what this actually reminds me of too is the Karen Reed trial that just happened in Massachusetts.
Right.
And all of those detectives and their inappropriate text messages they were sending to each other.
Totally. Yeah.
Did they learn nothing from this case?
Good question.
Thank you.
And then there was one of them had taken a picture of Frances's face and kind of pasted it into it was like a takeoff on like a Girl Scout kind of thing. But in the background, it said in the background of this picture, there is her burning house.
Yeah.
And in the caption says, you should have effing bought my Girl Scout cookies.
Yeah.
Something like that. And so there were all of these inappropriate emails. And so when the judge saw this, she was not too pleased. And I believe
that was an understatement.
Yeah. I believe that is an ongoing investigation with the Massachusetts State Bar as to what kind of discipline should be meted out with these two, assistant district attorneys.
But the critical piece of evidence that kind of brought all of this to a head was in 2017, the judge who presided over the third trial in which Frances was convicted, she actually allotted funds for the appellate attorneys to hire an expert in the state to further analyze Frances's pants and some of the fire debris. And this was really the mic drop moment because the expert concluded that there was no basis whatsoever for the prosecution's expert to testify and say that there was gas residue found on Frances's pants.
So the single piece of evidence connecting Frances to the fire is a fiction.
Right. It was a lie from the beginning. Mm-hmm. So the judge, of course, is like, no, this isn't good. The judge actually said, if I had known any of these things, talking about the email, talking about the experts, when that third trial happened where she was convicted, I would have declared a mistrial immediately. I believe we should vacate. Mm-hmm. And the prosecution did not oppose that.
They did
which
not.
They couldn't.
They specifically filed papers that we read that were like 70 pages long, detailing all the problems that happened in the case and admitting to them.
They had to.
They basically said, look,
all of this was inappropriate. We apologize. It never should have happened. Go ahead and vacate.
She gets a new trial.
Right.
But ultimately, after the convictions were vacated, the prosecution announced that they were not going to try her again.
So 17 years after her parents were killed.
She's 34 years old now.
Yeah. She was finally released from prison.
And in prison, Frances pursued a bachelor's degree from Boston University, which was pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Graduated magna cum laude. And attorney Sharon Beckman with the Boston College Innocence Project said, Frances can never get back the 17 years the criminal legal system took from her, but we are overjoyed at her exoneration and hope her case will inspire meaningful reform.
Then in 2024, so just last year, 3 years after this was vacated, Frances Choi received a $3.75 million settlement that will be paid out over the next 3 years. And then my understanding is she is currently living with family.
I read that as well.
Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, whichever you're doing. Keep coming with cases. Whatever that one case is from your childhood that you remember, if we haven't done it,
Totally.
we'd love to hear it.